Good morning. It's a pleasure for me to share this session and co-share with Laura Ciaprioli from Toronto University. This is a session, I think is a Canadian session, especially because most of the speakers are from Canada. But let me, so the title of this session is Sugars Reduction Strategies. And I think is a good, interesting session with a lot of speakers that they work on this. So Laura, perhaps you can introduce the first speaker.
Sure. It's my pleasure to introduce Karen Delacorte from Brigham Young University from the United States.
Good morning. Yes, coming from the US, it's wonderful to be in this beautiful country for the first time. And it's a privilege to contribute to this important discussion on sugar reduction strategies. There are many conflicting and simplistic narratives surrounding sugar. So I hope that this presentation will help to frame this session by providing practical context for targeting which sugars and in what context matter most. So sugar is consumed, assessed, and reported on in a variety of ways. Commonly within studies, it's lumped together as a uniform exposure to investigate its impact independent of food's source and form. However, as I'll talk about today, it's important to consider the context in which sugar is consumed, whether it's in liquid sources or added to foods as excess energy, intrinsic, or in substitution to determine its metabolic impact. Sugars can be categorized on a chemical level, and this might be useful when considering mechanistically the metabolic fates of fructose versus glucose. But when investigating sugar, we don't want to overlook the potential interactions with the food matrix. We want to understand whether it has differential impacts depending on the food source, whether it's added to that food or found naturally occurring within it. So doing so can help to explain why different sugar-containing foods may not have equivalent health impacts, even if they're chemically identical and consumed in the same amounts across food sources. So another critical layer to consider is the role of energy, which I'll also be talking about. Much of the purported harms of sugar appear to be mediated by excess energy intake, but this also might depend on the source as well. So in addition to my own research, which I'll be talking about today, much of what I'll present on is based on the foundational work that many of you here in this room, including many Canadian researchers, have published on sugar and chronic disease, which has really shaped the scientific landscape on this topic. So first, just looking at the outcome of type 2 diabetes. So when it comes to this relationship, much of what we know is based on studies that have investigated sugar more in the form of sugary drinks. But that's only part of the story. Sugar-sweetened beverages are very well studied because of their high intake in many countries and also the ease of measurement within studies. But this has left important gaps in understanding the role of other sugar types and sources. So to address this, we conducted the first comprehensive dose-response meta-analysis to evaluate not only different sugar types, like fructose, sucrose, total sugars, added sugars, but also to directly compare sugar-sweetened beverages and fruit juice, which had not been adequately examined side by side in relation to type 2 diabetes. We were able to include really large population sizes as listed there. We included 29 cohorts stemming from Europe, the United States, Asia, Australia, and Latin America. So here's a summary of what we found. On panel A, on the left-hand side, shows the risk of type 2 diabetes for every 20 grams per day intake in different sugar types. So sugar-sweetened beverages in the blue bars stands out with the strongest association with increased risk. Fruit juice, also in 20 grams per day, showed a smaller but still significant increase. In contrast, the same sugar amount from total added sucrose and fructose was not associated with higher risk. And for total sugar and sucrose, the association was even inverse, suggesting potential protection at moderate intakes. So clearly we see when the amount of sugar is the same, the impact can differ substantially depending on the type and source of sugar. Panel B, just off to the right, the far most right, 2 bars, models real-world serving sizes of sugar-sweetened beverages and fruit juice side by side. A 12-ounce soda, so about 39 grams of sugar, was linked to a 25% higher risk of type 2 diabetes, while in every 8-ounce servings of fruit juice showed a 5% increase. Those are the 2 significant findings. Off to the right, you see the dose response curves that further clarify that. The top left shows sugar-sweetened beverages having a very strong linear increase from the very first dose, indicating no clear safe threshold. Fruit juice all trends upward, but less steeply and with more uncertainty, likely dependent on whether it's 100% fruit juice or other fruit drinks, which we did pool together. Total added sucrose and fructose sugars show nonlinear or J-shaped curves that tend to trend downwards, suggesting a neutral or even protective impact at low to moderate intakes, but risk does increase with higher doses. So all of these findings were adjusted for, or most all of them were adjusted for energy intake, BMI, and many other lifestyle factors from the most adjusted models. So overall, these results suggest that sugar's health impacts on type 2 diabetes are not uniform. Only sugars from sugar-sweetened beverages and to some extent fruit juice, so liquid forms, consistently showed harm. So this underscores the need for dietary guidelines to distinguish between sugar types and sources and to not treat all sugars as equal. Otherwise, we might miss critical nuances that matter both for biological understanding, but also for public health guidance. So now let's look at, shift over to source-specific sugars and other chronic disease outcomes besides type 2 diabetes. I tried my best to summarize as much as I could there on that slide. This is pooled evidence on the left-hand side from meta-analyses of prospective cohorts. So just now looking at fruit and yogurt as sugar sources, they consistently show protective associations across many outcomes, including metabolic syndrome, hypertension, cardiovascular disease, and mortality. Dose response curves for fruit and yogurt are typically L-shaped, indicating risk at too low of intakes and benefit with higher consumption. Fruit juice shows a more nuanced dose-dependent association. So we see a U-shaped association for most of the outcomes. Moderate intakes appears to be neutral. But when studies specifically look at 100% fruit juice, the risk is lower compared to juice drinks. For treats and toppings, there have been wonderful studies done by Swedish and UK cohorts revealing U or J-shaped curves for cardiovascular disease and mortality. The lowest risk was with moderate intakes, between 5 to 9%. Looking at honey, ice cream, and confectionery, they're not listed here, but they typically show no associations when adjusted for many lifestyle factors, for many metabolic outcomes. So what is the percent energy of added or free sugars that's commensurate with optimal health or linked with the lowest mortality and cardiovascular disease rates? In a large Swedish cohort, added sugars intakes that were too low, so below 5% of energy intake, or excessively high, above 20% energy intake, were linked to the highest mortality in cardiovascular disease, showing a U-shaped curve. The lowest mortality was between so the lowest mortality rates were between 7.5 to 10% of energy intake. Importantly, when they compared sugar sources, only sugar-sweetened beverages were consistently linked to mortality, and that was not the case for any other sugar-containing foods. So these findings challenge the idea that less sugar is always better. Instead, they support a more nuanced view to limit sugar-sweetened beverages, but allow moderate intakes of added and free sugars for the greatest overall benefit. So when we isolate sugar-sweetened beverages, the previous slide only showed other sugar sources. Now just looking at sugar-sweetened beverages, the evidence becomes remarkably strong. Across multiple large meta-analyses, sugar-sweetened beverages are the only source consistently associated with harm across nearly every major health outcome. Hypertension, metabolic syndrome, type 2 diabetes, mortality show clear linear dose-response relationships, and similar significant findings for cardiovascular disease, NAFLD, and gout. So looking at large cohorts at the bottom there, comparing liquid to solid sources overall, For NAFLD, sugar-sweetened beverages, but not solid sources, were strongly linked. For colorectal cancer, sugar-sweetened beverages, not sugary foods, were associated with higher risk in a large multi-ethnic cohort. In the UK Biobank study, free sugars in beverages showed a linear increase in cardiovascular disease risk, while sugars from solid foods showed a U-shaped association. So there's a growing body of evidence that underscores that the form of sugar really matters. And liquid sugars carry the greatest risk. When sugar is consumed in a liquid form, it might have unique metabolic effects compared to when it's consumed in a fiber-rich cellular structure or another nutritious source. So based on this evidence, public health initiatives surrounding sugar should really prioritize reducing sugary beverage intake. So a central question is whether sugar's harm is due to its unique metabolism or simply from excess calories. From most prospective studies that I've referenced previously, they did adjust for energy intake, but this question is better answered within controlled trials. They provide stronger evidence to isolate sugar's effects in different energy contexts. So first, looking at the pooled effects of chemical sugars in substitution trials, when sugars replace macronutrients with no calories added, there's a lack of consistent evidence of an adverse effect. So fructose even shows slightly beneficial effect at low doses for glycemic control. Harm is really only seen at very high doses of isolated chemical sugars, especially with regard to triglycerides, but those don't really reflect real-world intakes. In addition trials, sugar is added to the baseline diet, creating excess energy, and these consistently show harmful effects. So for weight gain, higher triglycerides, insulin resistance, NAFLD markers, et cetera, for chemical sugars. So this indicates that sugar is only harmful when consumed in excess. But when looking deeper into many of these studies, it's largely based on sugar consumed in a liquid form. So the question arises, is the same true for actual sources of sugar consumed in excess or under other energy contexts? So that's why the work of Dr. Stephen Piper and many other wonderful Canadian researchers comparing food sources under different energy conditions has been so valuable for understanding this. So when looking at food sources, not just the pooled effects of chemical sugars, is when you see more of a signal. I'll very briefly summarize here what they found in their series of meta-analyses of controlled trials. The intake of sugar-sweetened beverages had an adverse effect on all of these listed outcomes. In some cases, they were harmful not just in addition trials, but also in substitution when energy levels stayed the same. Looking at other sugar sources, fruit and 100% fruit juice tended to be neutral or beneficial, and in some cases were protective, even when providing excess calories. For most other sugar sources, there were often null effects. Here and there you see that, like for example, sweets and desserts for uric acid, even in substitution was harmful, but on the whole, often null effects for many other sugar sources. So these important findings highlight the need to not lump all sugar-containing foods together in policy. Otherwise, we risk discouraging the consumption of nutrient-rich foods. So in a recent study, we examined how free versus intrinsic sugars compared to starch intake and fiber intake for body fat indices and cardiometabolic risk in substitution analyses. So this was a multinational cohort where diet and health status were assessed at multiple points over 18 months in a European cohort of over 1,000 participants from Denmark, Portugal, and the UK. And we found that substituting 20 grams of free sugar with intrinsic sugar led to significant decreases in multiple measures of adiposity. When that same amount of free sugar was replaced with starch, it resulted in significant increases in body fat and BMI. So starch led to greater increases in body fat than did free sugars. Additionally, when starch replaced free sugar, that is when we observed a significant increase in HbA1c. So this indicated that dietary starch might be more impactful for long-term glycemia than the moderate intake of free sugars. The fiber intake was very low in this population, so we inferred that the quality of the carbohydrate must have been more refined and lower quality. So altogether, we found that while intrinsic sugars and fiber were protective, starch was linked to higher fat and worsening cardiometabolic risk factors. Free sugar was either neutral or beneficial. So despite widespread belief, the idea that sugar as a chemical is somehow uniquely harmful or the main dietary driver of type 2 diabetes is not well supported by high-level evidence. Contrary to popular belief, refined starches often produce greater postprandial glycemic responses than sucrose or fructose-containing foods. In a previous sub-study shown off to the right there, together with Dr. Jenny Brown-Miller, a higher dietary GI was associated with increased risk of type 2 diabetes, whereas added sugar was neutral and total sugar showed an inverse association. This added to the common theme that I began to see in my research, which is really oppositional to what I initially believed to be the case, that when energy and BMI are controlled for, dietary sugar is not related to the risk of type 2 diabetes, the moderate intake of it. The major exception being when it is in the form of sugar-sweetened beverages, when it's consumed in excess. So sugar can lead to weight gain, which is on the pathway for many metabolic diseases. However, what I did find consistently was that glycemic index and low-quality starch were associated strongly with these outcomes, the risk of type 2 diabetes. So this suggests that GI and GL and other indices of carbohydrate quality, not sugar content alone, may be more relevant for glycemic control. Yet sugar tends to be really heavily emphasized and receives more attention in the popular media, even among health professionals when it comes to type 2 diabetes. So I believe that the glycemic index captures the real impact of carbohydrates' effect on blood sugar, regardless of whether those carbs are from starch or sugars. So we can learn a lesson from recent history. Nutrient-specific fear, like fat in the 90s, can lead to poor substitutions, which can inadvertently increase disease risk. A narrow focus on sugar can misguide reformulation efforts and overlook more harmful high GI foods. The public often views low sugar products as somehow healthier for them. These foods often swap sugar for refined starches, and this can lead to unintended health consequences. So we need to help educate the public, help them to understand that low sugar does not equal low risk. And to teach them that sugar can be enjoyed as part of a healthy diet, especially if it's primarily consumed in more of a solid form added to healthy foods. So if we have a single nutrient focus in health recommendations, then we risk discouraging the consumption of nutritious sugar-containing foods. But sugar-sweetened beverages are really the exception. They may be uniquely harmful in how they deliver sugar to the body and are consistently associated with harm. So reducing excess sugar, especially in the form of beverages, remains a prudent target. I believe that effective nutrition policy should avoid nutrient tunnel vision and instead emphasize overall carbohydrate quality. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. The next presentation is entitled Evidence for Different Public Health Approaches to Sugar Reduction. The speaker is Marie Labbé from Canada, also a professor emeritus and former chair of the Department of Nutritional Science at the University of Toronto.
Well, good morning, excuse me, and thank you very much for inviting me to speak to you today. As from the obvious part of my title, you can see that my research interest is in public health nutrition policies. I have no commercial conflicts of interest to disclose. Most of this research has been funded by the Canadian Institutes of Health Research or other government-type agencies. And I'm also been a member for many years of the new GAG committee and the earlier version of the Best Buys reports from WHO, which I'll speak to today. So I don't need to show this to you folks, but I think it's important to keep in mind that dietary risks are still one of the leading causes of chronic diseases. And in context of the world, about 70% of deaths are related to unhealthy diet and chronic diseases. But in Canada, that number, and many Western countries, the incidence of chronic disease is actually much higher, and it's about 88% in Canada, with 3 out of 5 Canadians having an NCD. Now, I'm going to show you a little bit about this tracking NCDs report, and this is really a Best Buys report put out earlier last year on how different food policies can impact the risk for chronic diseases. And they're rated 3 ways. Like, green ones are the Best Buys. They're the most cost-effective interventions for reducing chronic diseases. The orange are moderately cost-effectively, and the yellows are really where there's not a lot of evidence on the cost-effectiveness of the policies, but they are many examples of them in place. And I'm going to highlight some of the ones in this report because I think I was asked to speak about different food policies on sugar intake. So I'll talk about the ones that are relevant to sugars. And so if you want to reduce unhealthy diets, some of the most cost-effective interventions from a policy point of view are encouraging food reformulations, things like front-of-pack labeling, public food procurement policies, behavior change, communications, and policies to protect children from unhealthy food marketing. While less effective ones are taxation policies, and then some of the others listed. Now, if you notice, most of these were in green, a few in orange, and several in yellow. Well, if we actually look to the cost effectiveness of actually managing diabetes, it's more costly, and I don't think that's a surprise to people. It costs more money for every year's life saved to treat diabetes than to actually prevent it, and that goes for most chronic diseases. So it's not surprising that policies that affect the upstream in food environment can be more cost effective than actually treating diseases at the end. And when we look at Canadian foods, I mean, our diet in Canada is typically about 60% are highly processed foods. They're high in sugars, sodium, and saturated fats. And that tends to be a very similar pattern in many Western developed countries that rely on highly processed food supplies. And as I mentioned earlier, this has really led a shift in the last number of years of food policies that have really shifted the responsibility for healthy eating from the actual individual, giving them recommendations to how to eat healthier, to really saying, how do we shape that food environment to make it easier to eat healthier, whether it's originally from regulations mandating nutrition information, such as nutrition labels, to more recent examples of what I call regulations, and part of that regulation really either encourages or actually forces a reformulation of the food supply. And some examples of that could be trans fat bans, sodium reduction strategies, and things like front-of-pack warning labels, which work both ways, both in discouraging consumption of and purchase of those foods, but also encouraging manufacturers to reformulate their foods so they wouldn't have the front-of-pack warnings. So I'm going to go through a couple examples this morning of these different food policies and show how they work, the evidence behind them, and some thoughts to consider in those implementation of those policies. So the first ones I'm going to talk about is reformulation. And I think it was really fortunate that Dr. Delacourt spoke to me for me, because I think what I'm going to say today actually really reflects the other evidence that she's saying. So we have a program at University of Toronto that our group has led since 2010 called FLIP, and it's the Food Label Information and Price. And it's a database of all the branded foods that have been sold in Canada since 2010. And for example, our last data collection in 2023, we collected over 160,000 or almost 160,000 foods. So we pretty well capture about 90% of the branded foods. Well, nowadays, because we also use web scraping as well, we also have unprocessed foods in those collections. But we collect all the nutrition information, the ingredients, all the claims and pictures of the food. So we have a lot of information about these foods, which allows us to answer questions on food policy and how that impacts the food supply. And of course, there was a lot of methodology behind that because we're handling such large databases. So a couple of years back, one of my PhD students actually went and looked at the FLIP database, and we actually used the 2013 to 2017 database, and there'd been A lot of talk about sugar reformulation. There was a lot of talk about, the sugar reductions, the harmfulness of sugar sweetened beverages. There was a lot of focus on sugar reductions. So we went to the database and looked for matched UPC codes of foods that have been reformulated in that 4-year period to see which ones had lower sugars. And you can see, really, we particularly saw most of the reductions in beverages, cereals and grains, dairies, and desserts. And actually, we saw sauces and dips increase. And this was just manufacturer-driven reformulations. And you can see most foods didn't really change in that 4-year period. That's the dark gray in the center. And a few actually increased on the other side. But those 4 categories had the largest reductions in their sugar content over that 4-year. When we looked at what was driving and what manufacturers were doing to drive that reformulation or that lower in sugars, when we looked at the beverages, and I didn't put the data here, it was really the replacement of sugars with non-nutritive sweeteners. But when we actually looked at the foods, we actually saw a 29% reduction overall in these lower sugar foods. But that 29% reduction in sugars was only accompanied by a 3% reduction in calories and a 27% increase in starches. And so in follow-up now, I think that's really saying that we are not doing a benefit or a service to consumers when we actually see that level of starches being added to the foods to replace the sugars. But many of these foods now have lower sugar claims on the front of their packages. And just to give you an idea what the curves look like, for some foods like ready-to-eat cereals, it's pretty flat. The amount of calories and the amount of sugars are pretty linear and pretty straight. While things like baked desserts, we really do have some that use non-nutritive sweeteners. So we have some at the desserts, we have some at the lower end, which have put toppings and icings and things like that and used non-nutritive sweeteners instead of the starches. But as you get up, when you're actually changing the ingredients in the bakery products, then you get that leveling again. So what you're really seeing is the calories stay pretty much the same because the sugars that come out are being replaced by, in most cases, refined starches. So I thought it was really great to follow your presentation earlier to see this is what the food supply is actually happening. So this focus on low sugar is actually, other than beverages, is really not necessarily, definitely is not reducing calories, and that's how it's being accomplished by the starches. So just, I put a note of caution when we talk about sugar reformulation. When we're talking about sugar sweetened beverages, we reduce both sugar content and the calories. And there's lots of evidence out there that most of the harmful effects of excess sugar is mediated through the calorie. And that's work like John's and many others that have looked at those substitution studies. But the sugar reduction in foods is rarely accompanied by comparable calorie reductions. And it's usually accompanied by the addition of refined starches. So I think that's a note of caution, this focus on sugar reduction of this is what's happening in the food supply, unless there's guidance to also say that reduction should also be accompanied by substitutions such that the calorie reduction goes down. But that's hard to do in a solid food because you need that bulk of that carbohydrate in the food. So I'm going to talk a little bit next about sugar sweetened beverage taxes. That's a very popular recent addition to the portfolio of food policies to try and reduce sugar intakes, is to tax sugar sweetened beverages. And similar to the comment from our first speaker, the amount of sugar in an apple juice or a juice drink, they vary, but however, they also differ in the amount of free sugars or added sugars, which for a juice is virtually free sugars, while the juice drink or drink maybe not even doesn't ever have any fruit in it, is actually added sugars. Now, the most interesting one, I'm only speaking on one because the best evidence comes from the United Kingdom, where they instituted sugar sweetened beverage tax, or an drink industry levy. And what they did is they instituted a graded sugar sweetened beverage taxes. In other words, it was designed to both target the sugar level as well as to reduce intake. And they did that by having a tiered system. In other words, foods that were below a certain threshold had no tax added. And as it progressively higher levels of sugar, the tax got higher. And they subsequently now have a new proposal out to further lower the levels where the thresholds kick in, so that taxes will continue at lower and lower levels of sugar content in the beverages. And there's evidence that they have actually lowered the sugar intakes and sugar consumption of free sugars from drinks. And this is all the drinks in the UK. And so that includes both sugar-sweetened beverages, the juices, and all the drinks. And you can see, and this is important when you do these types of analysis, you don't just pick one point in time because sugar reductions are going down. The food industry is already reducing sugars in many of their beverages. And so there already was prior, you can see the first dotted line, there already was a gradual slope in sugars consumption in the UK. But when the tax came in, you can see that large break point. So the intakes have gone down in both adults and in children with their tax system. And I don't have time to go through all of the things, but I think it's a couple of points to mention. For sugar-sweet beverage taxes to really be impactful from a public health point of view, it really varies on the design of the taxes, like the type of the tax, the level of tax. Taxes are all the way from a few percentages, 5% to like somewhere like the Bahamas, which is up to 100% tax. So I mean, it's hugely variable. So obviously you'll get varying impacts. Whether you use a graded taxes or a flat rate tax, can be by volume, can be by sugar level. Then there's a lot of differences in the taxes around the world, and there's about 40 some countries now that have instituted sugar-sweetened beverage taxes, but they have different inclusions and exclusions. For example, are juices included, flavored milks included, coffees are not. Some of them just target the sort of carbonated beverages, and some are broader, include some of these other beverages. And I wanted to make a point here I'm not going to speak to, but we're involved with evaluating one province in Canada, Newfoundland and Labrador, instituted a sugar-sweetened beverage tax a couple of years back. But interestingly, it was not designed with no consultation with public health folks. It was designed as a revenue generation. It was a province that was having lack of funds coming in, high expenses, and they instituted as a way for a budget measure. And it actually, they considered a great success. It generated twice the amount of revenue that they thought they would generate, partly because the consumers didn't really know they were paying the taxes. It wasn't really designed to reduce the consumption of sugar-sweetened beverages. It was to use them as a tax to get more money. And consumers many of them didn't even realize there was a difference in the tax rates in different beverages. So from a public health point of view, it wasn't that effective. From a revenue point of view, it was quite effective. Unfortunately, just last month, they canceled the tax with the post years of inflation and worried about cost of living recently. They said that it was another tax on consumers, and that was a friendly thing they were doing to families to help them address the cost of living by taking it away. So short-lived, the data analysis will be out probably in the next months or years. We've got papers submitted on that. So the third policy I'm going to talk about is front-of-pack labeling. And this is, and I can't talk about them all, but I thought this is another interesting example of how some food policies have had impact on sugars. So as you know, consumers go into the store and it's really hard. Very few of them turn over a food package to look at the food label in the back. So how do they choose healthier foods, less healthier foods? And so front of pack labels, and this happens to be the examples, several examples from Chile, who are the first country to institute what I'd call warning labels on foods. Identify foods that are high in either calories, sugars, sodium, or saturated fats. And so it had two impacts when they looked at and this is, I think, only about 1 year after the study. They actually saw a lower number of foods that actually carried labels. So pre and post, it went down from 81% to 61% of foods carrying calorie labels, and from 46 to 24% of foods carrying sugar labels. So obviously the number of foods were either reformulated or discontinued, so they would not be carrying warning labels. And you can see the distribution of the intakes. They did shift to the left, and that there's more lower sugar foods were on the market. And where did those changes occur? Most of the changes, for example, in sugars were in beverages, and I call the flavored dairy products second category, and then cereals. Those are the main food categories that saw the biggest reductions in sugar levels, and then sodium were particularly in cheeses and deli meats and prepared meats. So you can see that when that high-end mandatory came down, the proportion of products decreased significantly from 2014 to 2017. So that really says the manufacturers have reformulated foods to have less sugars in them when the high-end symbol came about. But secondly, it also changed consumer behaviors. So with that law, there was actually a 23% reduction in purchasing of foods with front of packs. So in other words, consumers saw them and weren't purchasing that foods. And I use that example. They had a sugar sweetened beverage tax. It was quite a low tax. The rate that they set it at only had a 3% reduction in the purchasing of those sugar sweetened beverages. So that said a low tax, you'll have a low impact. But I also want to point out when you actually have these front of pack warnings, you actually have differential effects. So if you look at and it's the same and all, if you look at the slide on the far right for sugars or calories, it's a little larger to see. The 4.4% was the reduction in calories overall, but what it came from, you only got a 4% reduction or 6.4, excuse me, percent reduction in calories. But that was accomplished by, and I can't even read my own writing, so I have to stick my head down here, 33% reduction in the foods that were purchased that were high in sugar. But that was compensated by consumers buying more foods that were lower in sugar. So if the threshold was, say, at 15 grams, they may be still purchasing foods that are 10 or 12 grams that didn't have the warning. So those went up, but the overall net impact was still a negative reduction overall in sugar purchases, even though there was some increase to compensate with the ones that high in, was compensated by buying more what I'd call medium leveled sugar foods. And the same thing happened for calories, saturated fats, and sodium. So you did get negative overall net reduction. But if you just looked at the purchasing of the high foods, those definitely went down. But overall, there was some compensation by purchasing moderately high foods that didn't have warnings on them. And finally, I just want to show that when you talk about like front of pack warning labels are probably a fairly new policy intervention in the food supply. There's evidence to show that really the warnings tend to be the most effective in reducing purchases. And most of these are either experimental trials or a few countries that now have data of actual purchasing data in countries. And so I just think, why are these working? I mean, I think we have to remember that food purchasing is a fast decision making. So whatever policies we intervene have to be able to support fast decision making. And when we did research in Canada, we showed that people can make their decisions with a front of pack symbol, no matter what the symbol we use, about 2 to 3 seconds as opposed to 15 or 17 seconds to pick out the healthier food. Interestingly, this was a study of one of my PhD students, when we looked at this is a bunch of beverages and they had claims and front of packs, and they went from juices to what I call the tutti frutti drinks with never saw fruit in its life, but looked like a juice. And when you had consumers with low health literacy, they were not as able to distinguish the healthiness between all those products. They thought they were all fairly healthy and fairly tightly clumped. But when we actually gave them front of pack labels, they were able, like the adequate health literacy, those with adequate health literacy could tell the difference between the healthier, less healthier beverages. And we narrowed that again with front of pack labeling. So it just says that it really helps those with lower health literacy to understand the healthiness and choose healthier foods. And just to say, from the front of pack labeling experiments from Chile, they saw a high intakes of excess or higher intakes of non-nutritive sweeteners, particularly in youth and adolescents. That's led to Mexico, who introduced their front of pack labeling subsequent to Chile's. They now have a warning on their products that say below the labels contain sweeteners not recommended for children, and then also one to avoid caffeine. So it just says that they were concerned about the exposure of young children to non-nutritive sweeteners and added those warnings. So this is my last slide that just said, you know, all these policies have been shown to reduce sugar intakes, and they can be effective. But I think we have to remember they depend on the program design, the policy objective. I use the tax versus a public health objective, what foods are included in the exclusions, and sometimes they can come with unintended consequences. I think we see that with reformulation. We also see it with some of the sugar reductions in beverages. And with that, I want to thank you all very much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Mary. And your last note there on sweeteners leads us nicely into our next speaker, Dr. Tosif Khan from the University of Toronto, Canada.
Good morning, everybody. So before I start, my wife always tells me that I eat a lot of sweet things and you should reduce your sweetness. But what I heard this morning, I think Keith said that sweetness is not addictive, and I think Karen said that sugars are not harmful. And what I heard from Mary was that the low sugar products are actually not useful. So eat as much as you can, I think. So the message is eat sweet things. But of course, my topic, takes me to my topic. Is there a role of low calorie sweeteners in sugar reduction? How do I go next? Oh, yeah. So these are my disclosures. There's a lot of them, especially I think on the right, if you can see, I have taken honorarias and then speaker fees from organizations that are interested in non-nutritive sweeteners. I have consulted for them. I've written editorials about non-nutritive sweeteners and some of the issues that WHO has raised. And I drink a lot of non-nutritive sweetener beverages. And also people, when I tell them non-nutritive sweeteners have their usefulness, many people say you are being paid by these organizations. I said, yes, I'm being paid by these organizations, but that's not why I present that evidence. So today I'll present the evidence that is there. So clinical practice guidelines for obesity, diabetes, and heart disease are universal in recommending non-nutritive sweeteners as a strategy for sugar reduction. So these are some of the examples. I will not go through them. I was involved in the DNSG EASD guidelines, where we said the non-nutritive sweetener may be used to replace sugars in beverages and foods, and most of the other guidelines are similar. There's a slight change. I think American Diabetes Association just came up with a new recommendation where they just modified it to recommend water of non-nutritive sweeteners, but I think for moderation short term, they still recommended it. However, the dietary guidelines, on the other hand, are more conflicting. Some are opposing and some are some recommend a non-nutritive sweetener, non-nutritive sweeteners as a replacement of sugars. So the dietary guidelines for Americans and the UK guidelines, even the SACN, the new one, has recommended it. However, the Canadian guidelines say that sugar substitute should not be consumed without giving any evidence why. And the WHO guidelines are important, which I'll talk about later in this presentation. But they say, WHO suggests that non-sugar sweeteners are not to be used as a means of achieving weight control or reducing the risk of non-communicable diseases. It is a conditional recommendation, came out in 2023, and everybody was quite amazed how they came up with it. So our non-nutritive sweeteners can be used as a strategy to reduce sugars from calories, and what is their evidence? And what is the evidence of their benefit? So I'll quickly go through this hierarchy of evidence. So just focus on the top two. So there's randomized controlled trials you see at the top, and then after that, the cohort studies. So when you go up, the certain evidence increases and the risk of bias reduces. So randomized controlled trials are ranked above cohort studies because of the magic of randomization. Everything is equally distributed except for the intervention. So you can infer causality, but you cannot infer causality from observational studies or cohort studies. So I have collected some of the latest so this is the evidence from randomized controlled trials I put together. I think the large meta-analysis published in the last 3 years. One of them is from a WHO guideline. So it was so there was a WHO report which was a meta-analysis on which the guideline was based, but that's Lewis Levras, and so that is the 2022 one over there. But then there's others. So if I'm only focusing on body weight and energy intake, and what matters is what is the comparison. So when the comparison is sugar, if you notice at the top, If you replace sugar with non-nutritious sweetener, there's a reduction in body weight. If it's against water or where there's no caloric difference between the two groups, there is not much of difference because that's their aim. They replace calories. Similar with energy intake. We see the same thing. So it's important to see the comparator. So non-nutritious sweeteners do not have any pharmaceutical effects. They just displace calories. Therefore, the comparator plays a very important role in displacing those calories, and especially from high sugar sources. And for non-nutritious, especially for sugar-sweetened beverages, if they replace them, I think you will see a bigger effect, and that's what we see in many of the trials. However, if we compare them to something which is calorically matched, for example, water, you won't expect a difference, and that's what we see. However, when we look at cohort studies or observational studies, this is the overall, I put together the overall results from the WHO commissioned report. They looked at a lot of large cohorts and showed that if people taking low-calorie sweeteners have increased risk of type 2 diabetes, CHD, stroke, CVD, and total mortality. And the certain evidence is low to very low, but that's concerning, and also obesity. So that's concerning. So why is there a disconnect? So for trials, we see benefit, and for cohorts, we see an increase in the risk. So why is that happening? It's because of how trials are actually analyzed. So what we do usually is in trials is called a baseline or prevalent analysis. So we look at we measure the exposure through, for example, a food frequency question, and follow these people up and look at the outcome of the disease. People who are taking non-nutritious sweeteners are generally, and the assumption is that when you measure their exposure through food frequency questionnaire, that is their exposure all their life or the usual intake. But what happens is majority of these people who are taking non-nutritious sweeteners or non-nutritious sweetened beverages are the ones who have switched because of high risk. So they were at high risk of disease due to obesity or due to other high intake of sugar. They switched, and you're not measuring that switch, but what you're measuring is the non-nutritious sweetener. So it brings us to what is called a reverse causality. So being at high risk of obesity, type 2 diabetes, or CVD risk, they have increased their non-nutritious sweetener intake as a risk reduction strategy. And that's what we are measuring. And also there are other issues of residual confounding and behavior clustering. And there have been many, many letters, editorials, commentaries, guidelines, expert consensus on this topic, that this is an actual problem with observational studies studying non-nutritive sweeteners. And some of these are written by our group also, but there's a general consensus among experts that this is actually an issue. However, how can we resolve this? There is a method. So this prevalent analysis cannot capture the actual exposure for non-nutritious sweeteners. So there is an option of doing robust methods where you adjust or you do something to control for reverse causality. So you actually capture people who are actually taking the non-nutritious sweeteners. So there are two types of analysis you can do. One is substitution analysis and one is a change analysis. So this was a study done by one of our students, Jennifer Lee. She's now in TMU. So what we did was we did a systematic review meta-analysis of studies which looked at substitution of non-nutritious sweeteners with like sugar-sweetened beverages with non-sugar-sweetened beverages. And we looked at 3 pre-specified comparisons. looking at one serving change, one serving comparison. So sugar sweetened beverages were replaced with non-sugar beverages, or which is the intended substitution, or sugar sweetened beverages with water, which is standard of care. And also for reference, we also looked at the water versus non-sugar sweetened beverages. And the change analysis is when you look at the change itself, where you look at increase in number of beverage intakes or reduction in beverage intake. So that's not actually just a prevalent analysis, but you look at people, if a cohort has done multiple exposure measurements, you can look at change analysis. If they have increased their intake of sugar-sweetened non-sugar beverages, they must have replaced something because they're increasing their beverage intake. So when we look at intended substitution, we see reduction in almost all the major outcomes: body weight, obesity, CHD, CVD, total mortality. These are cohort studies. If you look at the standard of care, it's similar for sugar-sweetened beverages with water. You expect a reduction, and we see a lowering of risk. When we look at compare it to reference substitution, we do not expect a difference, and we do not see it. And when we look at a relation of change, when people increase their intake of non-sugar sweetened beverages, we see a reduction in body weight and a lowering of body weight and waist circumference. So robust methods can control for this bias of reverse causality with these two types of analysis. So what did WHO guidelines did? Because they actually recommended against it. So it was SRMA which was commissioned, and then the WHO guidelines came out in 2023. What happened was there are two issues there. So if you look at issue 1, they gave observational studies more weight in their recommendation. They ignored the established hierarchy of evidence. They should have given more weight to the control trials. They disregarded trial evidence, including long-term studies. So there were long-term studies. They analyzed it, but they said most of those studies were short-term, so this does not apply to long-term outcomes. And also, they relied on prospective cohort studies using prevalent analysis. So there were studies that are, for example, this change in substitution analysis, they did not look at them when they were making that recommendation. And they did not consider evidence from, so they did not look at those studies. So we did compare their analysis with our analysis in a paper we published. So this is a super plot. These are just overall results of various cardiometabolic outcomes and the results from the WHO prevalent analysis. So you see for obesity, type 2 diabetes, CHD, stroke, CVD mortality, total mortality, you see an increase in the risk. When we look at the same outcomes using substitution or change analysis, we see an improvement or a reduction, a lowering of risk, or at least a neutral result. None of the outcomes show harmful association when we use robust methods of change or substitution analysis. So that has to be remembered. So I have 2 slides left. So in conclusion, randomized control trials show that non-introduced sweeteners in displacing excess calories from calorie comparator lead to weight loss and related cardiometabolic outcomes. Prospective cohort studies that utilize robust methods, including change and substitution, gave consistent results with trials and demonstrate reduction in these major cardiometabolic outcomes. And dietary and clinical practice guidelines support the use of non-introduced sweeteners as a clinical and public health strategy because it helps reduce caloric intake or excess sugar intake. The discrepancies in guidelines is primarily due to reliance on prospective studies which use prevalent analysis, which are prone to bias. We should be using these robust methods, change and substitution analysis. That brings me to my next slide. So at the moment, we have embarked on a mega cohort pooling process. We approach these big cohorts with more than 100,000 people per cohort to look at to use robust methods to look at the association of non-nutritive sweeteners and many health outcomes, including type 2 diabetes. We have 7 cohorts recruited with 1.6 million people, and it's a Diabetes Canada grant, and we are planning to recruit some more cohorts. So phase 1 will do a meta substitution analysis, and the second phase will do IPD, a federated analysis. So this will then put that evidence together to for robust methods, and hopefully the guidelines in the future will be able to look at this evidence and revise it. Thank you, and these are the pictures of my team and the people in the lab. Thank you.